Why Carol Marcus didn't return after Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Bibi Besh played Dr. Carol Marcus in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, but she didn't reprise Carol in any subsequent Star Trek, the original series movie. Directed by Nicholas Meyer, Star Trek II was released in 1982 and brought several new aspects to Star Trek. Along with the death of Spock, Leonard Nimoy, Star Trek II introduced the newly 50-year-old Admiral James T. Kirk's William Shatner lost love, Carol, and their son, David Marcus, Merritt Buttrick. While David's story came to a sad end in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, Carol didn't come back at all. Dr. Carol Marcus is the inventor of Project Genesis and the Genesis device, a technology she developed alongside David. Project Genesis was intended to address the problems of hunger and overpopulation in the United Federation of Planets. Genesis was a terraforming technology that could transform a dead planetary body into a world capable of sustaining human life. The Genesis device was stolen and weaponized by Khan Noonien Singh, Ricardo Montalban, who detonated it, inadvertently creating the unstable Genesis planet. But through Carol, Star Trek II gave Admiral Kirk a meaningful relationship that ended badly and needed resolution. Why Bibi Besh's Carol Marcus didn't return in Star Trek III. Bibi Besh's Dr. Carol Marcus was entirely written out of Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, by producer Harve Bennett, who penned the screenplay. Although Bennett initially earmarked Carol to return in Star Trek III's outline, he felt the character was extraneous, and Harve excised the elder Dr. Marcus to cut back on the sequel's budget. Bennett also couldn't account for how Carol wouldn't know that David used protomatter in the Genesis device to make it unstable. Director Leonard Nimoy agreed that Carol's presence complicated Star Trek III, so Bibi Besh wasn't invited back to reprise her role. According to the Making of the Trek films edited by Edward Gross, Bibi Besh had a hard time accepting being left out of Star Trek III, The Search for Spock. Although Besh sent Harve Bennett a letter after she saw Star Trek III, telling the producer she understood why Carol wasn't in the film, Bibi remained disappointed that Carol's story with Kirk never got to continue in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, or the next two Star Trek movies. Bibi Besh passed away in 1996, but she is still fondly remembered as Carol Marcus by Star Trek fans. No, Carol Marcus left Kirk and his son's Star Trek story incomplete. The problems of Carol Marcus being left out of Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, and the rest of the Star Trek, the original series movies, are compounded by how David Marcus was killed off. In Star Trek III, David joins LT Saavik, Robin Curtis, to explore the Genesis planet, where they discover the resurrected Spock. But Klingons soon arrive on Genesis and hold David, Saavik, and Spock hostage. Kruge, Christopher Lloyd, orders David's execution, which Admiral Kirk is helpless to stop. Bibi Besh was disappointed that the Star Trek movies never allowed Carol and Kirk to have closure over David's death. Kirk barely has time to mourn David in Star Trek III, although Jim gets revenge on Kruge for killing his son. Yet Kirk's main focus in Star Trek III is to rescue Spock and get him to Vulcan. David's death isn't raised in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, and the loss of his son is an undercurrent for Kirk in his subsequent Star Trek movie appearances. Star Trek never addressing how Carol felt about David's death is a glaring omission. Carol Marcus's Star Trek legacy continued after Wrath of Khan. J.J. Abrams' Star Trek Into Darkness was a remake of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Set in the alternate Kelvin timeline, Star Trek Into Darkness repeated or inverted many aspects of The Wrath of Khan, including bringing back Carol Marcus. Alice Eve played Carol Marcus, the daughter of corrupt Starfleet Admiral Alexander Marcus, Peter Weller, in Star Trek Into Darkness. This version of Carol doesn't have a romantic relationship with Captain James T. Kirk, Chris Pine, but Dr. Marcus became a source of controversy for one scene where she strips to her underwear. In the vast universe of Star Trek, filled with beloved characters and interstellar adventures, certain figures stand out not only for their importance to the plot, but for the intriguing questions they leave behind. One such character is Dr. Carol Marcus, introduced in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, 1982, as a brilliant scientist and the mother of Captain James T. Kirk's son, David. Despite her significant role in this film, Carol Marcus never returned to the Star Trek franchise in a meaningful way, a fact that has sparked discussion among fans for decades. The absence of such a potentially pivotal character can be traced to a combination of narrative focus, creative decisions, and evolving dynamics within the franchise. Carol Marcus in The Wrath of Khan. When we first meet Carol Marcus in The Wrath of Khan, she is presented as a scientist leading the Genesis Project, a revolutionary initiative designed to terraform dead planets into habitable worlds. Her brilliance, coupled with her past relationship with Captain Kirk, places her at the center of a story that delves deeply into themes of legacy, aging, and sacrifice. Her son, David, is also central to the plot, marking the first time Kirk confronts his personal legacy in a tangible form: his son, the life he left behind, and the responsibilities he chose not to face in the past. Carol's significance in The Wrath of Khan cannot be overstated. She represents a life Kirk could have led, and through her, audiences get a glimpse of a more grounded, personal side of the famously adventurous captain. While Kirk grapples with the no-win scenario of Khan's revenge, Carol Marcus grounds the Genesis device in the film's larger exploration of creation and destruction, life and death. Despite this, Carol Marcus was absent in the following Star Trek films, most notably Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, and Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, leaving fans to wonder why her character wasn't revisited. Given her prominence in The Wrath of Khan, this decision seems curious, especially since the films that followed continued to focus on Kirk's personal journey and his relationship with David, leading to David's tragic death in The Search for Spock. The narrative focus shift. One key reason for Carol Marcus's absence after The Wrath of Khan likely lies in the shift in narrative focus in the Star Trek films that followed. While The Wrath of Khan is a deeply personal story for Kirk, subsequent films expanded the scope to focus more on the ensemble cast of the original Star Trek crew and the broader adventures of the Enterprise. After all, Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, primarily deals with Kirk's mission to recover Spock, taking precedence over his relationship with Carol and the Genesis projects. Additionally, Kirk's emotional arc in The Search for Spock is more closely tied to his son David than to Carol. The film explores Kirk's grief after David's death at the hands of Klingons, but rather than reunite Kirk with Carol for this emotional reckoning, the film chooses to emphasize the captain's sorrow and eventual acceptance without revisiting their romantic history. David's death becomes a pivotal moment for Kirk, one that ties into his broader narrative of loss and sacrifice, but Carol's presence would arguably have complicated or detracted from this emotional focus on Kirk's internal journey. Creative decisions behind the scenes factors also played a role in Carol Marcus's absence. Harve Bennett, the producer and co-writer of The Wrath of Khan, had a specific vision for the film and its characters, and while Carol Marcus was integral to the Genesis storyline, her narrative purpose was largely fulfilled by the end of the film. Once the Genesis device had been deployed and the emotional weight of Kirk's relationship with his son established, there may have been little creative motivation to bring her back. Moreover, the Star Trek films of the 1980s were deeply concerned with themes of friendship, aging, and loyalty among the original Enterprise crew members, particularly the relationship between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. As a result, much of the emotional and narrative space in later films was devoted to these long-standing relationships, leaving little room for characters like Carol Marcus, who were tied more closely to Kirk's personal life than to the overarching mission of the Enterprise. Character evolution and legacy. Carol Marcus's absence can also be seen as a reflection of the franchise's reluctance to delve too deeply into Kirk's past or personal life outside of his duties as a Starfleet officer. While Kirk's relationship with his son is explored,